I don't feel safe sitting next to her. But when she saw the FBI badge, silence. The cabin lights cast a soft glow over the packed airplane as passengers shuffled down the narrow aisle, dragging carry-ons and stowing bags in the overhead compartments. It was a Thursday evening flight from Indianapolis to Charlotte, the kind of route filled with business travelers trying to get home and families hoping for a weekend getaway. People looked tired, impatient, eager to take off and be done with it. Danielle Harris adjusted the strap of her purse as she reached row 14, seat A, her assigned window seat. She slid into her spot smoothly, set her small black carry-on beneath the seat in front of her, and exhaled. A quick glance at her watch. Right on time. She wasn't in a hurry, wasn't stressed. Flights were just another part of her routine, one of the many she'd taken for work. She settled in, scrolling through emails on her phone, her expression calm and unreadable. She was used to this, the small talk, the forced politeness of air travel. But tonight, she wasn't in the mood. She just wanted to sit, fly, land, and go home. But then, she heard it. A sharp intake of breath. A pause. She didn't even have to look up. Someone had stopped right beside her row, lingering just a second too long. Margaret Reynolds stood stiffly in the aisle, gripping the strap of her leather handbag. Her seat was 14B, right beside Danielle, but her face tightened the moment she saw her. She hesitated. Just a second. Just enough for someone paying attention to notice. Danielle noticed. Margaret glanced toward the front of the plane, her eyes darting as if she were considering whether she could switch seats. But the flight was full. She had no choice. With an exaggerated sigh, she finally sat down. The moment her body hit the seat, she pressed herself as far away as possible, as if physical distance could somehow shield her from whatever imaginary threat she had just conjured up in her mind. Danielle didn't react. She'd seen it too many times before. The shift in posture, the small but obvious body language cues. She kept scrolling on her phone. No need to engage, not yet. But something told her this wouldn't be just another silent, uncomfortable flight. Because Margaret wasn't done. But what was coming next was going to be much worse. For the first few minutes, it was nothing more than a quiet storm brewing beside her. Margaret sat stiffly, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her breath just a little too controlled. Every so often, she'd shift, glancing toward Danielle, then away, then back again, like she was waiting for something to happen. Danielle had seen this before, that silent discomfort. She wasn't doing anything, just sitting, just existing. And yet, that alone seemed to be a problem for the woman next to her. The flight attendant's voice crackled over the speaker. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're finishing up our final checks. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened, tray tables are up, and all electronic devices are in airplane mode." The cabin settled into a quiet hum of last-minute preparations. A businessman across the aisle tucked his laptop away. A young mother soothed her baby in the row ahead. Someone behind them sneezed. Margaret flinched. Danielle caught it. The smallest movement, but noticeable. She could almost hear the thoughts running through this woman's head. Why is she here? She doesn't look like she belongs. She must be up to something. Danielle stayed focused on her phone, keeping her breathing even. Stay calm. Let it play out. But then, Margaret did something that made it crystal clear this wasn't just in her head. She reached up, pressing the call button. Danielle paused, not surprised, just tired. The small overhead light flicked on. A flight attendant, a woman in her early 40s with an efficient, polite demeanor, made her way down the aisle and stopped beside their row. "Yes, ma'am," she said, her voice patient. Margaret leaned in slightly, just enough to make it seem like she was being discreet, but still loud enough for the passengers nearby to hear. I don't feel comfortable," she murmured, glancing toward Danielle without making direct eye contact. The flight attendant blinked. "I'm sorry, ma'am. Is something wrong?" Margaret inhaled sharply as if she were making some great effort to contain her concern. "I just have a bad feeling." Danielle stilled. She set her phone down, slowly lifting her eyes toward Margaret. "A bad feeling?" the flight attendant repeated, frowning slightly. Margaret swallowed. I think she should be checked, or moved." Silence. For the first time since she boarded, Danielle turned her full attention toward the woman beside her. Margaret finally looked at her just for a second, before quickly averting her eyes. The businessman across the aisle made a small noise of disapproval. The mother in front of them turned her head slightly. People were starting to listen. The flight attendant's expression tightened. "Ma'am," she said carefully, "is there a specific reason you feel uncomfortable?" Margaret hesitated, but only for a second. I don't know. I have a feeling." Danielle let out a slow breath through her nose. Same story, different setting. She stayed quiet, for now. The flight attendant shifted awkwardly, clearly trying to find a way to de-escalate the situation. "Ma'am," she said again, lowering her voice, "unless you have an actual concern, I can't move another passenger just because—" Margaret cut her off. "I'm just saying, it's better to be safe than sorry." Another ripple of tension moved through the surrounding rows. Danielle could feel the weight of other eyes on them now. Some passengers looked away uncomfortably. Others were openly staring, waiting to see how this played out. The air inside the cabin suddenly felt thick. The flight attendant hesitated, then carefully she turned toward Danielle. "Ma'am, I'm so sorry, but we might need to—" But before she could finish, Danielle calmly reached into her jacket and pulled out her badge. And just like that, the entire energy in the cabin shifted. The second Danielle's FBI badge came into view, the temperature in the cabin seemed to drop. The small leather case flipped open in her hand, revealing the golden shield and identification card with her name and credentials clearly printed. Margaret's face drained of color. Her mouth parted slightly, but no words came out. The confidence, the smug righteousness she had just moments ago, had vanished. The flight attendant's eyes flickered between the badge and Danielle's face, then back to Margaret. Passengers nearby leaned in, eyes wide, some whispering to one another. Danielle took her time, letting the silence stretch. She tilted her head slightly, her voice calm, steady, and razor-sharp. "You were saying?" Margaret blinked rapidly, her throat bobbing as she struggled to recover. I didn't mean—" she stammered, hands gripping her purse as if it could somehow shield her from the situation she had just created. Danielle didn't break eye contact. Margaret looked away first. The businessman across the aisle let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. The mother in the row ahead exchanged a glance with her seatmate, both of them looking at Margaret with undisguised disappointment. The flight attendant exhaled, looking as though she was just now realizing the full weight of what had happened. Her voice was noticeably firmer this time. "Ma'am, if you're uncomfortable, we can find another seat. For you." Margaret flinched. "No, I didn't mean to cause trouble. She trailed off, realizing there was no way out of this that wouldn't make her look worse. Danielle didn't smirk, didn't gloat, didn't say another word. She simply tucked her badge away, turned back to her phone, and continued scrolling as if nothing had happened. That was the part that stung the most, being dismissed so effortlessly. Margaret sat frozen, face burning with embarrassment. The flight attendant cleared her throat. "All right," she said, forcing some cheerfulness back into her voice. "If there are no actual concerns, let's get ready for takeoff." She turned and walked briskly back toward the front of the plane, not sparing Margaret another glance. The overhead speaker dinged. "Flight attendants, prepare for departure." The mother in front of them shook her head, muttering under her breath, "That's what she gets." A few rows back, someone chuckled. Margaret sat rigid, staring straight ahead, hands clenched in her lap. And as the plane taxied down the runway, the tension lingered in the air like smoke. But the lesson had already been served. The plane had started its slow, steady ascent into the night sky, but the weight of what had just happened hadn't lifted. Margaret sat stiffly, eyes locked straight ahead, her breathing just a little too controlled, as if she was forcing herself to appear composed. But her clenched jaw and the way she kept fidgeting with the strap of her purse gave her away. She wasn't okay. Danielle, on the other hand, was completely at ease. She sat back, resting her elbow on the armrest, scrolling through her phone as if the entire interaction hadn't even registered. She didn't tap her foot, didn't shift uncomfortably, didn't react at all. And that made it so much worse for Margaret. She wanted Danielle to be upset, to argue, to demand an apology, anything that would make her feel like she could defend herself, but instead she had been dismissed. Passengers were still whispering about it. The businessman across the aisle was smirking slightly, shaking his head as if he'd seen this kind of nonsense before. The mother in front of them wasn't even trying to hide her disapproval. She glanced back once, her expression making it crystal clear what she thought of Margaret's little stunt. Even the flight attendants had changed their demeanor. Margaret had gone from being the polite, middle-aged woman who needed assistance to the woman who tried to get an FBI agent kicked off a plane. And now, she was alone. She didn't even dare glance at Danielle. Not after that. But Danielle could feel it, the tension vibrating off of her like static. The woman was humiliated, embarrassed, trapped in her own shame. And that, right there, was justice. Not revenge. Not a public takedown. Just truth. Laid out so plainly that there was nowhere to hide. A soft ding came from overhead. The captain's voice crackled through the speaker. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've reached our cruising altitude of 35,000 feet. You are now free to move about the cabin." Margaret didn't move. She wouldn't move for the rest of the flight. And Danielle? She just kept scrolling, but Margaret would never forget this night. The plane settled into a quiet hum, the initial rush of movement fading as flight attendants began their rounds with drink carts. Conversations picked up in hushed tones, but there was still a distinct weight in the air. Margaret had barely moved. Her posture was rigid, hands folded tightly in her lap. Every so often, her fingers twitched, like she wanted to grab her phone and distract herself, but she didn't. Maybe she was too embarrassed to risk drawing more attention to herself. Across the aisle, the businessman casually sipped his drink, occasionally stealing amused glances in her direction. The mother in front of them leaned in to whisper something to her seatmate, both shaking their heads. Margaret felt it. The judgment, the disappointment, and the worst part, there was no escaping it. She had done this to herself. Danielle, on the other hand, was completely unbothered. She scrolled through her phone, checked a few emails, and even took a moment to glance out the window at the endless stretch of darkness below. Cool, collected, unshaken. It wasn't the first time something like this had happened to her, wouldn't be the last. But it wasn't her job to make people like Margaret feel better about their ignorance. She wasn't going to offer reassurance. She wasn't going to say, "It's okay," because it wasn't. And Margaret was learning that in real time. The flight attendants made their way down the aisle, offering drinks and snacks. When they reached row 14, the woman serving looked pointedly at Danielle first. "Something to drink, ma'am?" she asked with a small smile, her voice warmer than before. Danielle met her eyes, reading between the lines. The attendant wasn't just being polite. This was an unspoken apology. Danielle gave a small nod. "Just water, thanks." The attendant poured her a fresh cup, setting it down gently on her tray. Then, without looking at Margaret, she moved on. Margaret swallowed hard. She wasn't invisible, but she might as well have been. She picked at the corner of her napkin, her breathing shallow. Danielle could feel her squirming. Not physically. Margaret barely moved an inch. But emotionally, mentally. The realization was sinking in. There was no way out of this. No justifications, no excuses, no one coming to her defense. And that was justice. Not a dramatic confrontation, not screaming or yelling, just truth. And truth had a way of cutting deeper than any argument ever could. Margaret wasn't going to forget this. Not tonight, not ever. And maybe, just maybe, she'd think twice before making the same mistake again. The flight continued on, but the real journey, the one happening in Margaret's head, was far from over. She didn't touch her drink, didn't ask for anything, didn't even shift in her seat. She sat there silent, the weight of her own actions pressing down on her like a lead blanket. The thing about moments like these, they don't just disappear, they stick, they linger. Because once you've been forced to see yourself, really see yourself, there's no looking away. Margaret had spent her whole life moving through the world comfortably, unquestioned, unchallenged. And then, in the span of just a few minutes, that comfort was ripped away. No one had yelled at her, no one had shamed her publicly. The truth had been enough, and the truth was this. She had judged someone based on nothing but her own biases. She had assumed, she had accused, and she had been wrong. Would she learn from it? Would she change? That wasn't for Danielle to decide. Danielle had already moved on. As the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their descent into Charlotte, Danielle finally stretched, letting out a quiet yawn. The flight had been just another Thursday evening for her. For Margaret, it had been a reckoning. The plane touched down smoothly, rolling to a stop as passengers unbuckled their seatbelts and reached for their bags. The flight attendants thanked everyone for flying. Danielle stood, grabbed her carry-on, and stepped into the aisle. Margaret didn't look at her. She couldn't, and that was fine. Danielle hadn't expected her to. As she walked toward the exit, the businessman across the aisle gave her a knowing glance, a subtle nod of respect. She didn't acknowledge it, but she didn't have to, because the lesson had already been taught. And now the world was watching Margaret. What she did next, that was on her. This story isn't just about one flight. It's about the assumptions people make every single day, the judgments, the biases. It's about what happens when those assumptions collide with reality. And the truth? Racism isn't always loud. Sometimes it's as simple as a woman pressing a call button because she had a bad feeling. But what happens when the person you try to judge isn't who you think they are? What happens when they hold more power than you assumed? Margaret learned her lesson the hard way, but the real question is, how many others still need to? If this story makes you uncomfortable, ask yourself why. Because at the end of the day, the real challenge isn't just recognizing racism, it's doing something about it. Would you stay silent? Would you call it out? Or would you be Margaret? Now, the question is yours to answer. What would you do?